Hello everyone, welcome to those left standing. You've done very well. We have just 5 very excellent speakers to finish off the session and the day. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kerr. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an ecologist over on Eyre Peninsula and I'll be running the session. And to start with, we've got Karla Berris from Juno, who's been over on Kangaroo Island for 1.5 years now, and she's going to give us an update on the glossy black cockatoos. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Yeah, as Greg mentioned, my name's Karla Berris. I work for Natural Resources Kangaroo Island, and I manage the glossy black cockatoo recovery program over there. And this is currently funded by the Australian Government Biodiversity Fund, but this project has actually been running for over 20 years now, and it's quite a long-term recovery project, which is really fantastic. And today I'm going to be talking a bit about one of our key management actions, which has been to install artificial nest hollows across Kangaroo Island. And I'll just be giving you a bit of information on how successful that program has been, and also talking about what factors have influenced the use of these hollows across the island. So, there we go. So for those of you who don't know anything about this species, I'll give you a little bit of background. So there's the glossy black cockatoo up there, that's a female. They occur on Kangaroo Island, but they're currently restricted to Kangaroo Island. So previously they used to occur on the Fleurieu Peninsula and up into the southern Mount Lofty ranges. And there's also evidence that they used to occur on the lower Eyre Peninsula. We don't really know where, so I just put a blob there. The problem with glossies is they're really fussy eaters, so they only feed on one species of tree. They feed on the cones of the drooping she-oak, Alocasuarina verticillata, and that's pretty much absent from a lot of the landscape on mainland South Australia now where they used to occur, so unfortunately they did go extinct. On Kangaroo Island though, we're really lucky that we do have some really good remnant patches of this sort of feeding habitat left, but some surveys in the 1980s and 1990s found that the population had actually dropped down to about 150 individuals and was believed to still be in decline, and we still had quite a bit of habitat there, and it was believed to be able to support quite a much larger number of birds than that. So there was a bit of confusion as to why the population was in a state of decline. And what they found is Kangaroo Island's actually got an additional threatening process, and this is common brush-tailed possums. So brush-tailed possums feed on the eggs and the nestlings. They'll get into the hollows and predate on them. And they are native to Kangaroo Island, but they've really flourished on KI thanks to agricultural clearance, and we've got all these really good quality patches of remnant veg left in the landscape, and they're actually in much higher densities than they should be. So they've increased, which has been quite detrimental to the glossies, because the glossies are actually trying to nest in those little remnant patches of habitat. So the recovery program was initiated in 1995, and there's been a number of major actions that have occurred. So the biggest one was to try and stop the possums eating the nestlings, and we do this by putting corrugated iron around the base of trees. We also climb up the trees, prune all the bridging canopy so the possums can't jump across, and that's made a huge difference to the breeding success. So prior to this we were recording breeding success around 20%, and that's been increased to anywhere between 38 and 72% since management. We also manage feral honeybees, which like to invade the hollows, and we do a lot of revegetation work. So since 1995, there's been about 150 hectares of drooping she-oak woodland replanted on KI. There's also been, we've been involved with about 70 hectares on the lower Fleurieu. So that's been a really major part of the program, and a very successful one, because actually most of our revegetation is now used by the glossy blacks. And then we've got these nifty little PVC numbers up there, which are our artificial nest hollows, which I'll be talking more about today. So just quickly, the overall effect of these management actions has been an increase in the population. So back in 1995, they were recording around 150 individuals. The last 2 years, we've been recording in excess of 350. So that, that's sort of an extra 200 individuals over 20 years. You might think that's a bit slow, but that's actually really fantastic, because this species, pairs of glossies, can only produce 1 clutch a year, and in that clutch, they lay a single egg. So the maximum reproductive output for a pair of glossies is 1 chick a year. So this is actually really quite fantastic. So I'll be talking a bit more about the artificial nest boxes that we've got across the island. So we've got over 100 spread across from one end of the island to the other now, and we've placed them at all sorts of different locations, but they've generally centred around feeding habitat and close proximity to the drooping sheoak woodland. And basically, since the start of the recovery program, volunteers and previous staff members have been out there recording breeding success and monitoring breeding productivity in this population. And we monitor the artificial hollows, but also natural hollows as well. And then on top of that, we leg band quite a large portion of the nestlings, and we follow them through to adulthood and look at survival and movement. So the stuff I'm going to present here is sort of a collation of that past 20 years of data, which has been collected by lots and lots of people over the years. So they like artificial nest boxes. Particularly since about 2007, they've been using about 50 to 60% of the pairs we monitor are now using artificial nest boxes instead of natural hollows, which is really quite significant. And the good thing is there doesn't actually seem to be much difference. Well, there's no statistical significance anyway. There's no difference between the success rates in these artificial nest boxes or natural hollows, so it's not detrimental for them to be using them in high numbers, which is good. And it actually seems that they prefer using the artificial nests. So this data's from last year, in 2015, our breeding season. The birds used about 36% of the available artificial nest boxes, and they only used about 19% of the available natural hollows. I do have to point out, though, that that number of natural hollows is only based on the hollows that we've seen them use previously. There's probably a lot more natural hollows out there in the landscape, so that difference could even be quite a bit larger. So I wanted to have a bit of a look into what's driving the use of these artificial hollows, and one thing I wanted to check was that because we were having all these chicks born in artificial nest boxes, I just wanted to make sure that this wasn't influencing them to want to use more and more nest hollows, artificial nest boxes as adults. So I looked at the females in particular, and it was a pretty similar story for the males. I looked at breeding pairs and what their natal nest type was, and then with our leg-banded individuals looked at what nests they'd use over their lifetime as adults. And there was really no difference between the nest choices of females raised in artificial nest boxes or natural nest hollows. They were using these nest boxes in sort of similar proportions. So we looked a bit more at the landscape scale. Now this is a map of Kangaroo Island here, and each one of these yellow portions, except for that little section there and that little section down the west, each one of these sort of sections here represents what we call a flock region. And basically, we have a flock of birds in each of those regions, and the adult breeding pairs tend to stick within the confines of that area. We do get movement between flocks, primarily of sort of younger subadult individuals, but most of the breeding pairs tend to stick to these sort of areas we've defined here. And what you'll notice by looking at this map is, obviously, Kangaroo Island has had a significant amount of clearance as well. Mostly the sort of the eastern and the northern sections of Kangaroo Island have seen a lot of vegetation clearance, and it's along this north coast where a lot of the drooping sheoak woodland and nesting habitat used to occur. So the recovery program in the past has mapped all the potential nesting habitat. So it's mostly sugar gum, Eucalyptus cladocalyx, which are really big trees. They drop limbs, they make really good hollows. So we've mapped that across the island, and we've got sort of estimates of how many hectares of this vegetation type is in each of those flock regions. And what we sort of found is when I plotted the available breeding habitat per individual against the usage rates of artificial nests, it sort of turns out that in the areas where there's less natural nesting habitat, they're using more artificial nest boxes. Now that's not, very surprising. But that's good to know because it sort of means our mapping is quite accurate, and if we put nest boxes in areas where we know that the habitat is lacking, they're probably going to use them. But I looked at the actual nests themselves a little bit more closely, and what we found is we've got this portion of nests that have been used a lot. Some of those are getting used repeatedly year after year and have been used for almost 15 years straight now. But then we've got about 29% of these nest boxes that have never been used. And I thought, okay, they'll probably occur in regions where we've got lots of available nesting habitat naturally. But that wasn't actually the case. A lot of these ones here are actually in areas where they're short on natural nesting habitat. And that was a bit surprising. So I had a bit of a look at the finer sort of landscape scale stuff of where they were placed within the flock region. And one thing came out as really important. And so here you can see the artificial nests that are frequently used, that are getting used time after time, all have at least one or more natural frequently used nests within a kilometre radius of them. But the main thing about a lot of these artificial nests that have never been used is they actually don't have any natural nests within a 1 kilometre radius. So just putting nests purely next to what we thought was good feeding habitat isn't enough. And the explanation for this is probably that glossy blacks tend to like to nest communally. So this was sort of reported in some of the early literature in the early, the late 90s. But we see it even more now. We've got nesting sites that have up to sort of 5 or more birds all trying to nest in sort of about a few hundred metres of one another simultaneously. So they really prefer to nest communally, and so just placing nest boxes out in the landscape near feeding habitat is not quite enough for them. So this is important because as part of our Australian government funding, we're looking to put an extra 40 nest boxes out into the field this year. And we really want to put them in the best place that they're going to get used, because it's obviously quite a costly and time-costly exercise putting them out there. So in addition to putting them in these areas that are coloured up here, which are the areas where the habitat's really lacking, it's also really important that if we have a natural nest in an area, to centre these artificial nests within a 1 kilometre radius, so that we're actually simulating this communal nesting that they seem to really like. So that's going to be quite important when we're installing these nest boxes. And just finally, another thing we're sort of working on at the moment is actually putting remote cameras up onto these nests and having a look at what other species enjoy using them. And we know that the yellow-tailed black-cockatoos really enjoy using them. We see a lot of nestlings fledging from these artificial hollows. We also get the shell ducks and the owls. But we've got a couple of less desirable species here, the little corellas and the galahs. Now, neither of these are native to Kangaroo Island. They've actually self-colonised since the island was opened up to agriculture. And so with the yellow-taileds, they start nesting in about October. They nest over summer. They're sort of fledgling once the glossies are wanting to use the hollows. So the glossies are nesting from sort of late summer through to winter and sometimes right through to spring. The problem with these guys down here is they like nesting quite early. So end of winter, they're trying to get in those nest boxes. And we've actually recorded fatalities where nestlings have been killed or have gone missing and eggs have been smashed that we think are due to these guys. And now that we've actually got these cameras up on the nests, we're getting quite a bit of evidence of that. And it appears that it's actually the corellas that are the more sort of aggressive of the two. If there's a chick in there, this has actually got a glossy chick in it. They'll be getting in the nest box. We can't really see what they're doing, but we've had chicks go missing, and they will actually try and remove the nest content so they can take over that nest, and pretty much the next day they're nesting in there. Whereas these guys they'll harass the chick, but they won't actually kill it as such from what we've seen so far. So that's a little bit of an extra project that we're working on now, and we hope to have some results on it in the next couple of years. And just finally, this project has been running, as I said, for over 20 years, and it's really a testament to all the volunteers and previous staff members that have worked so hard to see this species recover. So I'd like to thank them for helping collect all this data as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Karla. That was excellent. And we have plenty of time for questions.
We lost... Yeah, so bushfires are a big issue, and that's why originally our sort of thoughts were to spread the artificial nest hollows across different locations to sort of, that's one of the reasons you want to sort of spread the risk. But yeah, we did lose one nest box at the Western River fire in that area, and the main issue there was we actually lost a really big patch of significant feeding habitat. So, yeah.
Right up the top.
I'm not sure about that, but generally we've got a pretty good handle on where the birds feed and so forth, and I think that's where a lot of these early nest boxes were placed, in areas they were feeding. But what's sort of come out is they'll actually fly a bit of a distance to get back to nesting habitat that for whatever reason they've chosen is quite significant, and they don't actually go to these other areas that we're trying to encourage them to. So yes, there's sort of some historical nesting there that they tend to seem to go back to these same places every year.
And sorry, we're going to have to stop there, but thank you, Karla.